A stunted grille shell too short for the car it's bolted to, a dashboard where none of the gauges match, pulled from three different sources, crammed into one panel like whoever built it ran out of the right parts and decided the wrong ones would do. A firewall cover in cheap aluminum, the kind of thing you'd call a patch job if you saw it in a driveway. This is the most copied 32 Ford in the world. Not the cleanest, not the most correct, not the one hot rod historians point to as a technical masterpiece. This one, mismatched dash and all, has been rebuilt, replicated, and trailered to more car shows than any other five-window coupe Ford ever built. And the man who put it in front of a camera didn't pick it because it was good. He picked it because it wasn't. There's a second thing most people get wrong about this car, and it has nothing to do with how it looks. They assume that once the cameras stopped rolling, it went into a vault somewhere, a prop, mothballed, forgotten. It didn't. It kept moving. Different hands, different decades, different states. The trail is fully documented, right up to today, and almost nobody who loves this car has ever followed it. Both of those things, the ugliness that became the standard and the ownership chain nobody tracks, are the same story. This is that story. Start with what nobody puts on a poster. Before it was cast in anything, this was a used car. Reports differ on the number, somewhere between $300 and $1,300 picked up off a California lot by the production, but every account agrees on the shape it was in. Full fenders, a 3-inch chopped top, primer gray with red fenders that didn't match, an interior finished in red and white plastic, the kind of upholstery job done cheap and done fast. It wasn't a showpiece. It wasn't even finished. It was a partially built street rod of the kind that existed by the thousands in the early 1960s, somebody's weekend project abandoned or sold off before it got where it was going. Here's what matters about that. If you'd shown this car in that state to a hot rod purist in 1972, you would not have gotten reverence. You would have gotten a shrug. Maybe a note on the fender mismatch. This was not a car anyone was writing about. It had no reputation. It had no owner history worth telling. It was inventory. That's the before. An unremarkable, half-finished coupe sitting on a lot worth exactly what someone was willing to pay for it that week, and nothing more. George Lucas grew up cruising the streets of Modesto, California, and when it came time to find the car that would carry the emotional weight of that world on screen, he wasn't looking for a trophy. He was looking for the truth of what those streets actually looked like. And the streets he remembered weren't full of polished show cars. They were full of cars exactly like this one, home-built, mismatched, held together by whatever parts were on hand. So the rough condition wasn't a problem to solve before filming. It was the reason the car got picked in the first place. The production had the fenders pulled to create the traditional Deuce highboy look, lighter, meaner, more purely a street car, with small cycle-type fenders bolted back on just enough to keep it plausible within the world of the story, where full hot rods were still technically supposed to run some kind of fender. It's a detail easy to miss. Even the choice of how much to strip the car down was calibrated to a specific texture of authenticity, not to make it prettier. Uglier, if anything, but truer. This is the moment worth sitting with, because it's the hinge the entire rest of the story turns on. Nobody looked at this car and saw a future icon. Somebody looked at it and saw exactly the right kind of nobody's icon. A car so unpolished it could pass as something a teenager actually built in his garage, because in spirit, that's precisely what it was. What went under the hood didn't match the era on screen either, and that's worth being direct about. The story is set in 1962. What's actually powering the car is a 1966 Chevrolet 327 V8, putting out somewhere around 350 horsepower, dressed with a Manna Fray intake manifold, 4 Rochester 2-barrel carburetors, and custom sprint car-style chrome headers. None of that is a period-correct 1932 Ford flathead setup. All of it is deliberately, confidently anachronistic, chosen not for historical accuracy, but for the sound and the stance the production wanted rolling down Modesto's main drag. It's a small, specific irony, A car whose entire legend rests on being the ultimate expression of home-built early 60s hot rod culture is, mechanically, running an engine that hadn't been built yet in the year the story takes place. Nobody watching the film clocks this. It doesn't matter that they don't. The car reads as authentic because everything about its presentation, the mismatched panels, the stripped stance, the sound of it, lines up with what the audience already believes a hot rod like this should be. The engine underneath is theater. The theater works. Crews also rigged detachable camera platforms to the car, allowing Lucas and his team to shoot the in-car driving sequences. A practical solution, unglamorous and completely invisible in the finished film, which is exactly the point of good picture car engineering. You're not supposed to see the work. On screen, this is John Milner's car, the reigning, undisputed fastest thing in the valley, driven by a character who's aged out of his own mythology before the movie even starts. Everyone in town knows the car on sight. It's the measuring stick every other driver in Modesto gets measured against, right up until a stranger in a black '55 Chevy shows up and doesn't back down. The car doesn't need dialogue to establish what it is. It announces itself the way the best picture cars do, through sound, through the way it sits, through the way every other character reacts to it pulling up. That's the version most people carry around in their heads. King of the street, untouchable, immortal. It's a version built entirely on a car nobody thought was worth writing about 18 months earlier. Here's where the gap actually lands. Ask hot rod builders and historians today which 32 Ford gets replicated more than any other on Earth, and the answer, consistently, is this one. A car that by the hot rodding community's own standards isn't even considered a particularly good build. The stunted grille shell, the mismatched dash gauges, the tacky aluminum firewall cover. These are treated by purists as flaws. And yet this is the car that shows up, in tribute form, at nearly every major street rod gathering in the country, street rod nationals included, decade after decade. That's the measurable shift. A car with no reputation before casting became the most imitated example of its entire body style after. Not the cleanest 32 Ford, not the most historically correct. This one. There's a larger claim that gets made around this film, and it deserves to be handled honestly rather than repeated as fact, that this movie is the reason modern hot rodding, the whole street rod movement as it exists today, took the shape it did. That claim shows up constantly in enthusiast writing, and there's real substance behind it. This film unquestionably put backyard-built, early 60s cruising culture in front of a mainstream audience at a scale nothing before it had. But it didn't happen in isolation. America in 1973 was already leaning hard into nostalgia for the pre-upheaval late 50s and early 60s for reasons that had nothing to do with any single film. And the movie landed just months before an oil embargo that would reshape car culture in America all on its own, cruising and horsepower both suddenly harder to justify. So call this corroborated, not confirmed. The film is a major accelerant of a wave that was already building, not the sole cause of everything that followed. The honest version of the story is still remarkable. It doesn't need the overstated one. What's not in dispute is the object itself. Whatever share of credit belongs to the film versus the moment it landed in, this specific car, mismatched dash and all, became the template. Builders don't chase the cleanest 32 Ford in history. They chase this one. Most people who love this car have never once wondered what happened to it after filming Wrapped. It feels like the kind of question with no satisfying answer. Like it should have been scrapped or lost or locked in a warehouse nobody has the key to anymore. It wasn't. The trail is unusually clean for a movie car this old. Universal Studios held on to it through the 1970s. In 1981, it was sold to a Kansas City collector named Steve Finch, who restored it back to its original movie-accurate appearance. Which tells you something on its own. Even 8 years after release, the specific mismatched, stripped-down look of this car was already understood as the thing worth preserving, not a flaw to be corrected. In 1985, Finch sold it on to a San Francisco collector, Rick Figari, who is reported to remain its owner today. 3 owners, one consistent decision made independently by each of them to keep the car as the world remembers it rather than restore it into something nicer. Nobody along that chain tried to fix the mismatched dash or true up the grille shell. The imperfections that made it right for Modesto's main drag in 1962 are the same imperfections a string of private collectors chose to protect, decade after decade. That's the quiet ending most fans never picture. Not lost, not scrapped, not forgotten in a lot somewhere, just quietly, deliberately preserved, exactly as ugly as it always was, by people who understood that the ugliness was the whole point. If you're drawn to this car and wondering what it would take to actually stand next to one, the good news is that you don't need to chase a numbers-matching restoration or a six-figure barn find. Genuine 1932 Ford Model 18 chassis and five-window bodies still circulate in the street rod market, and steel and fiberglass reproduction bodies for this exact body style have been in active production for decades. This is one of the best supported platforms in all of hot rodding, precisely because so many people have wanted to build a version of this car for so long. What you're replicating if you go this route isn't precision, it's character. The mismatched gauge dash, the stunted grille shell, the stripped fender stance, none of it requires rare, unobtainable parts. It requires the willingness to build something that looks lived in rather than showroom perfect, which, if anything, makes this one of the more forgiving classic builds to take on. You're not chasing perfection, you're chasing a specific, well-documented kind of imperfection, and that's a much easier target to hit. Nobody involved in casting this car believed they were building a legend. They were solving a much smaller problem. Find something rough enough to be believable, cheap enough to risk on a low-budget picture, and mean enough to hold the screen against everything else in the frame. They found a used-up coupe with a mismatched dash and a chopped top, sitting on a lot, worth whatever the next buyer would pay. Every 32 Ford Tribute built since, every one of them chasing this exact mismatched dash, this exact stunted grille, is chasing a car that was never supposed to be the good one. It was supposed to be the real one. Somewhere along the way, those turned out to be the same thing. It's still out there tonight, in private hands, in San Francisco, looking exactly as wrong as it did the day someone decided that was precisely right.